by scratching the surface, you get a terrible shock. It's such it's a heinous crime. People are so shocked by what...
The decision was delivered without ceremony, yet its impact struck Windsor like a thunderclap. Princess Catherine had been named the sole custodian of Windsor Castle's historic records, giving her exclusive authority over documents that preserve generations of royal secrets, private correspondence, and disputed family decisions. Camilla was not appointed as a partner, advisor, or ceremonial overseer. She had been excluded completely, and everyone in the room understood what that exclusion meant. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had signed the formal order in private, but the power contained in it reached far beyond one room. Windsor Castle's records were not simply old papers stored behind locked doors. They included personal letters, confidential household decisions, succession-era correspondence, private agreements, and accounts of family disputes capable of changing how entire reigns were remembered. Custodianship meant the legal and symbolic responsibility for deciding who could inspect, protect, release, or permanently seal those documents. By naming Catherine alone, the king had placed enormous influence in the hands of the future queen. William stood beside his wife when the sealed document arrived. Catherine read the decisive sentence once, then returned to it as though the meaning might change. It did not. She had been granted sole authority, with no shared role, guaranteed consultation, or independent access offered to Camilla. The princess lowered the page slowly. Pride never reached her face. She understood that this was not merely an honor. Every sealed file carried the possibility of pain, and every decision she made could protect the monarchy or reopen wounds it had spent years trying to contain. Camilla learned the news from a senior courtier, rather than from Charles. The queen consort listened without interrupting, until the official used the word soul. Her expression hardened. She had not simply been forgotten in an administrative arrangement. She had been deliberately placed outside the circle of control. When the courtier finished, she asked whether any consultation privilege remained. The answer was no. That refusal transformed surprise into humiliation. Then the true danger emerged. Catherine's authority extended to a restricted collection of 20th and 21st century files, including correspondence connected to royal marriages, private negotiations, succession fears, and periods of severe family crisis. A documented archive briefing confirmed that one of those files had been requested only days before Charles signed the order. The request had come directly from Camilla's office. To understand why Catherine was trusted with the monarchy's most sensitive paper trail, and why Camilla regarded the decision as a personal humiliation, the loyalties and fears of everyone involved must first be exposed. Behind the official language of custodianship stood two women whose places within the monarchy had never been equal, simple, or emotionally secure. Catherine represented continuity, restraint, and the future of the crown. Camilla had spent decades surviving judgment, rebuilding her position, and defending the legitimacy she had finally achieved. Now Windsor's most guarded records had been placed in the hands of the future queen, while the reigning queen consort was left outside the locked door. Catherine understood why Charles had chosen her. As the Princess of Wales, the wife of the future king, and the mother of the next royal generation, she stood at the center of the monarchy's long-term future. The title marked the senior woman preparing to support the next reign. But the records carried more than ceremony. They would shape how William's leadership, his family, and the choices preceding his accession might eventually be understood. Camilla viewed the decision through a more painful history. She had spent years moving from public rejection to royal acceptance, and every privilege gained had become proof that her position was finally secure. Access mattered, because exclusion had followed her for much of her life. Recognition mattered, because she knew how quickly legitimacy could be questioned. Catherine sat with William after the announcement and admitted that the appointment might be presented as a victory over Camilla. The prince answered carefully. Avoiding conflict, he said, could not mean abandoning responsibility when the crown required a trusted guardian. His reassurance did not remove her unease. She knew that every locked file could deepen the distance between two women already separated by history. Camilla dismissed her staff and remained alone, pressing her fingers against the edge of a writing desk. The queen consort understood that records concerning the most controversial years of Charles's private life could now be controlled by Catherine. That knowledge felt less like administration and more like exposure. The king had not discussed the final wording with his wife before signing. A documented account from the drafting office showed that he had considered shared consultation, then removed every reference to it shortly before completion. Even more troubling was the Grey Catalogue, an internal inventory of sealed correspondence that only the custodian and the sovereign could authorize for examination. Its existence meant certain files were protected even from senior relatives. Charles had not acted suddenly. One damaging incident inside Windsor had convinced him that shared access was no longer safe. The appointment may have looked sudden, but its true origin lay in one private confrontation months earlier, a moment so damaging that the palace could never return to its previous arrangement. The turning point came on a winter evening, when Windsor Castle had fallen quiet and most of the royal household had withdrawn. A request marked urgent arrived at the archive office after normal hours. It sought temporary access to a sealed collection of private correspondence from the years surrounding Charles and Diana's collapsing marriage. The authorization had not come from the king. It had been issued through Camilla's private office, and the archivist refused to release the file. Sealed royal records could not be opened through ordinary household channels. Every request had to state a precise purpose and receive direct approval from the sovereign or the officially appointed custodian, the person legally responsible for controlling access to protected material. File WC-17 contained private letters, legal notes, diary extracts, and communications involving Charles, Diana, palace advisors, and members of both families. It was among the most sensitive collections held at Windsor. The incident would later become known inside the palace as the Midnight Windsor Request. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Camilla's deputy private secretary arrived carrying a written demand for the file, claiming the queen consort needed it before a private discussion the following morning. The senior archivist refused to open the cabinet and telephoned Catherine, who was temporarily overseeing heritage matters. The princess listened without interrupting, then instructed him to keep the file sealed until Charles personally confirmed the request. Her decision was calm, but its meaning was explosive. Camilla learned within minutes that Catherine had intervened. During a later private exchange, the queen consort accused her of behaving as though she were an intruder inside her own husband's history. Catherine answered that the rules existed because memory could become a weapon when fear decided who controlled it. The conflict deepened when Charles examined the paperwork himself. A documented internal review showed that the stated purpose preparing material for an anniversary exhibit was false. No such exhibition had been approved. Worse, WC-17 contained correspondence Camilla had never previously been allowed to read. The king understood immediately that the request had not been careless. Someone had deliberately used a false explanation to reach the most dangerous years of his private life. He ordered a confidential inquiry and instructed the archive to preserve every access record, signature, and telephone note connected to that night. Catherine remained silent, knowing her refusal had protected the collection, but also pushed the rivalry into the open. Camilla remained furious, convinced that the future queen had judged her before hearing her defense. Before the review could be completed, Charles summoned both women to the same room. What began as an unauthorized request would now become a direct reckoning, with Charles seated between the woman he married and the woman he had chosen to trust with the crown's memory. There were no aides, no secretaries, and no prepared statements when Catherine entered the private sitting room at Windsor. Camilla was already there, standing beside an untouched tea service, while Charles remained near the fireplace with the disputed request placed on the table between them. The door closed. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Camilla looked directly at Catherine and asked the question that had been consuming her. "Who gave you the right to stop me?" The king had arranged the meeting to prevent the archive dispute from spreading through competing royal offices and becoming an open war inside the household. At that time, the princess held temporary heritage responsibilities, meaning she could pause suspicious requests involving protected royal records, though she did not yet possess permanent custodial authority. Camilla accused her of using her position as the future queen to place herself above the reigning monarch's wife. Catherine did not rise to the attack. She answered that the file had remained sealed because the authorization was incomplete, the stated purpose was inaccurate, and no one had provided Charles's direct approval. The queen consort turned toward her husband, expecting him to defend her. He remained silent. That silence cut more deeply than Catherine's refusal. When she demanded that he speak, Charles finally asked why her office had claimed the correspondence was needed for an anniversary exhibition that did not exist. Camilla's anger faltered. In a recorded account of the meeting later preserved in the internal review, she admitted the truth. She wanted to know how the letters had described her during the collapse of Charles's marriage to Diana. She feared that history would preserve her forever as the woman who destroyed a family, regardless of everything she had endured or rebuilt afterward. Catherine listened, but she did not retreat. She revealed that she had never opened file WC-17 and had never asked the archivist to describe its contents. Her decision had not been driven by curiosity, rivalry, or a desire to expose anyone. She had protected the rules without seeking personal knowledge. That contrast changed the room. Camilla wanted access because she feared the past. Catherine had resisted access because she understood its power. The queen consort looked toward Charles once more, but the monarch offered no rescue. She left without touching the tea. The door closed behind her, and the silence returned. Then Charles asked Catherine to remain. He told her the crown required a custodian who could resist curiosity, pressure, and personal fear, even when the truth involved those closest to the throne. The confrontation had exposed the emotional wound, but Charles's next move would prove that this was no longer simply a family disagreement. It had become a test of who could be trusted with royal power. Charles did not make the decision because Catherine had demanded authority. She had asked for nothing. That was precisely why he trusted her. In the days after the confrontation, the king reviewed confidential assessments, archive protocols, and handwritten notes from previous custodians. Yet the decisive moment came without lawyers or courtiers. Alone in his study, Charles reread Catherine's instruction from the night of the request. "Do not open anything until the proper authority is confirmed." The words carried no ambition, only restraint, and restraint had become the quality the monarchy needed most. As sovereign, Charles retained final control over the royal archives, but he could appoint a custodian to manage access, preservation, classification, and sensitive historical review. A custodian is the person formally trusted to protect records and decide how they may be examined. The choice would shape more than one collection. William would inherit the crown, Catherine would stand beside him, and their children would one day understand royal history through evidence guarded by whoever held that authority. The king knew what exclusion would do to Camilla. She had fought for decades to secure her place, and denying her even a ceremonial role would feel like another judgment on her past. Yet allowing personal fear to influence access to sealed material could damage the credibility of the institution itself. Charles carried that conflict to Anne. In a private conversation later recorded in his confidential notes, he placed the draft order before his sister and asked whether he was being cruel. The Princess Royal read the wording before answering. Cruelty and consequence are not always the same thing. Her reply did not comfort him, but it gave the decision moral clarity. Then the internal review delivered a darker finding. 2 earlier informal inquiries from Camilla's household had sought information about sealed records connected to Diana. Neither request had succeeded, yet both showed a pattern of interest that could no longer be dismissed as curiosity. Advisors suggested giving the Queen Consort a ceremonial consultation role to soften the blow. Charles refused. He inserted the word soul himself, removing every possible doubt about who could issue instructions. Catherine alone would hold operational authority. The monarch signed the order, then remained seated long after the ink dried. Before any announcement was released, he decided to tell his wife personally. For the next conversation, he could not hide behind advisors, protocol, or legal language. The document had established Catherine's authority, yet the deepest consequence would not appear in the archive, it would be written across Camilla's face, when Charles finally told her what he had done. Charles told Camilla before the household announcement, but he could not soften the meaning. She sat opposite him as he explained that Catherine would become sole custodian, and that all existing archive permissions linked to the Queen Consort's office would be reviewed. Camilla did not interrupt. Only when he finished did she remove her reading glasses, place them carefully on the table, and ask whether he believed she could no longer be trusted with his past. The king did not answer immediately, because any response offered by a husband would collide with the judgment he had delivered as sovereign. The new arrangement meant her staff could no longer submit direct requests, arrange private archive consultations, or receive restricted inventories without Catherine's written approval. A restricted inventory was an internal list identifying sealed records too sensitive for ordinary access. Camilla would retain her ceremonial place at Windsor, but her relationship with its documentary memory had been reduced to the same controlled process applied to other senior royals. She heard the distinction clearly. Her title remained. Her influence did not. Charles finally told her that the decision concerned procedure rather than punishment, yet the words brought no comfort. After he left, the Queen Consort remained seated before the closed folder. She stared at it for several minutes, then summoned an aide and quietly cancelled an upcoming meeting connected to her legacy projects. The future she had worked to secure now felt vulnerable to documents she could neither examine nor explain. Outside the room, Charles paused. Guilt pulled him back toward the door, but he did not return. Going inside as her husband might weaken what he had just established as monarch. That restraint protected the order while deepening the wound. The shift in authority began before the public heard a word. Courtiers redirected unresolved archive questions to Catherine's office, moving influence away from Camilla through calm administrative instructions. The princess received a key case containing access seals, the official devices used to authorize entry to protected collections, and signed the first custodial register. Yet her opening decision surprised everyone. She did not request file WC-17. Instead, she ordered it sealed for a fixed protection period, refusing to turn another woman's fear into an opportunity for personal knowledge. William watched his wife accept the keys without triumph. The prince understood that the appointment could define her future queenship, but he also saw how heavily it rested upon her. He asked to speak with her alone before the next order was issued. As Camilla faced the silence of exclusion, Catherine confronted a different fear, that accepting the crown's trust might permanently turn another woman's pain into part of her own legacy. That evening, William found Catherine alone, with the archive keys still unopened beside her. No courtiers stood nearby, and no official papers separated them. She admitted that the appointment felt less like a triumph than an inheritance of every unresolved wound within the family. William sat opposite her and said the power would only change her if she began using it to settle personal scores. Catherine answered that the records would be protected, not weaponized, rewritten, or used for revenge. The princess understood that her new authority reached far beyond locked cabinets. She could approve historical research, supervise preservation, protect sensitive material, and recommend when certain documents might eventually be released. A release schedule was the formal timetable, deciding when restricted records could become available for study. Yet every decision would place her between private suffering and public truth. Files involving Charles, Camilla, William, Harry, Diana, and future generations could force her to balance compassion against accountability. Catherine told her husband she would never become the person who decided which relative deserved to be remembered kindly. Her duty was to preserve evidence, not manufacture innocence. William listened, then confessed something more difficult. Part of him felt relieved that correspondence involving his mother could no longer be reached through emotionally driven requests. He had spent years protecting Diana's memory from being softened, exploited, or turned into a weapon. Yet the prince also knew that guarding one woman's legacy could become cruelty toward another if anger controlled the process. Catherine refused to let that happen. She drafted an ethical protocol requiring dual documentation for every restricted request, including any request made by herself. The protocol was a written set of rules designed to prevent personal authority from operating without a clear record or independent review. By limiting her own freedom, she proved that sole custodianship did not mean unchecked power. Then she wrote privately to Camilla. The note promised that no sealed record would be released, changed, or used against her, and that every decision would follow the same standards applied to the entire family. It was not an apology. Catherine would not apologize for protecting the archive. But it offered dignity where humiliation had begun. Camilla read the message twice and placed it beside the cancelled papers for her legacy meeting. The queen consort did not reply that evening. Her silence left the palace uncertain whether resentment had hardened or restraint had finally been understood. Catherine had chosen restraint when she could have chosen dominance, and Camilla's response would determine whether the monarchy witnessed a lasting feud or a painful acceptance of the new order. By sunrise, the decision was no longer confined to Windsor's private corridors. A national newspaper appeared with a stark front page. Catherine's portrait beside the words, "Guardian of the Crown's Secrets," while a smaller image of Camilla carried the caption, "Queen Left Out." Television panels called it a constitutional signal. Crowds gathered near Windsor's Henry V Gate. And one truth dominated every conversation: the future queen had been trusted with the monarchy's memory over the reigning king's wife. Commentators immediately treated the appointment as proof that influence was shifting toward William and Catherine as the crown prepared for its next generation. Palace officials tried to describe the role as a heritage responsibility rather than a personal rejection. But the word sole made that defense almost impossible. Sole custodianship meant that one person alone held formal authority over access, protection, and future review of the records. Catherine encountered the story at breakfast. She read the headline once, then turned the newspaper face down. The princess was disturbed not by the attention on herself, but by the way Camilla's humiliation had been presented as her victory. William watched her reaction and understood that the public had reduced a painful duty to a contest between two women. Camilla faced a harsher judgment. A broadcaster described the queen consort as ceremonially senior but historically sidelined, suggesting that her title remained visible while her influence over the monarchy's memory had vanished. She switched off the television before the segment ended and sat without speaking. The silence carried defeat, but it also carried a decision. Outside Windsor Castle, a small crowd gathered near Henry V's gate. One woman held a handwritten sign declaring, "Protect history, don't rewrite it," while reporters debated whether Catherine's appointment marked the unofficial beginning of William's future reign. Then the palace received Camilla's unexpected response through a documented instruction sent from her private office. She ordered her staff not to challenge the appointment publicly and permanently withdrew the request for file WC-17. The queen consort would not seek the correspondence again. Her surrender did not erase the pain, but it prevented the dispute from becoming an open war. Charles read the withdrawal twice. The king understood that his wife had accepted the boundary without receiving the reassurance she had wanted from him. He could not reverse the decision without destroying Catherine's authority, yet he could no longer pretend that duty had carried no personal cost. The public had already declared winners and losers, but inside Windsor, the true verdict would be decided by three people confronting what trust, dignity, and duty had cost them. The final meeting was not held to renegotiate the order. Charles had made that clear before Catherine and Camilla entered. The custodianship would remain exactly as signed. Yet the king understood that a monarchy cannot survive through documents alone. It survives through the people required to carry their consequences. Catherine arrived with the archive keys. Camilla arrived without advisors. Charles placed the original request between them, then said it would be sealed with the rest. The monarch confirmed that Catherine would remain the sole custodian of Windsor Castle's records, and that the appointment was permanent rather than temporary or ceremonial. Custodianship meant the formal authority to protect the collection, control access, and decide how sensitive material would be preserved. Charles reminded both women that the records did not belong to either of them personally. They belonged to the continuity of the crown, the principle that the monarchy's responsibilities and historical truth must survive beyond any individual reign. Fear, rivalry, and private intervention could no longer be allowed to shape that duty. Camilla finally spoke without anger. In a recorded account preserved after the meeting, the Queen Consort acknowledged that requesting file WC-17 had been a mistake driven by insecurity over how history might judge her. She did not ask to see it again. Personal pain, she admitted, could not be turned into institutional authority simply because the past remained difficult to face. Catherine listened carefully before answering. The princess told her that preservation was not punishment. She promised the archive would neither erase Diana's suffering nor reduce Camilla to a convenient villain for future generations. Truth would remain intact, but it would not be used for revenge. Charles then issued one final instruction: the Midnight Windsor Request, the internal review, and Catherine's ethical protocol would be preserved together inside a sealed administrative file. An ethical protocol was a written system of safeguards designed to prevent power from being exercised without records, limits, or accountability. Future historians would therefore understand not only what decision had been made, but why restraint had become necessary. Camilla remained beside the king, but her influence over the historical records had ended. Catherine emerged not as a conqueror, but as a guardian whose authority became stronger because she had limited herself. The verdict was unmistakable. One woman had allowed fear to challenge the boundary, while the other had protected that boundary without exploiting her weakness. And so the doors of the Windsor Archive closed under Catherine's authority, not as a weapon against Camilla, but as the monarchy's final declaration that its history must be guarded by the person strong enough to possess power without using it for revenge. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.